Thanks so much. It's great to be back here. I love coming to this group. And I'm sorry I couldn't bring better weather, but I'm hopeful that November will eventually end. So Lewis began with a definition of civility. There are lots of definitions of civility. I'll offer another one to start with. Civility is the baseline of respect that we owe one another in public life. You can think of civility almost as the threshold of good manners. It's sort of the baseline, really, of decency. And it helps us avoid overt rudeness. And as Lewis already indicated, I think we think of kind of a crisis in civility in the United States right now, and we trace it to our politics. And if you think about the recent history of it, you might even say began in last presidential election in 2016. And during that presidential election, there were many, many episodes where you could see a baseline of basic respect being violated or denied. And you could pick your favorite examples. One that struck me, just because it's not what you typically see in a presidential election, was during the primary season when Senator Marco Rubio and then candidate Donald Trump got into a fight over the size of Donald Trump's hands, right? And whether or not he had the stature to lead. And this spat over the size of his hands, or the size of Donald Trump's hands, even extended into one of the debates itself. It was a question that was a subject of that debate. I don't know if you know this, but there was a political action committee formed after this spat called Release the Measurements. Look into the size of his hands. And there was actually investigative reporting. The Washington Post tracked down, it's true, tracked down an imprint of Donald Trump's hands, which they had made when he was exploring the idea of having a wax statue of himself made, so they did imprint of his hands. So if you're interested, Donald Trump does have small hands for a man of his height. So we figured that out in the presidential election. Now, when you see this kind of incivility in politics, you might think initially that we're living in an age of no decency, right? That there's a civility crisis. First point I want to make today is that don't be so quick to judge when you see instability in our politics, that it's indicative of a deeper crisis. And the reason why is that a lot of incivility in politics is strategic or tactical. We will often see candidates in public life violating norms of respect in order to generate publicity and attention, and then to direct the resulting publicity back to themselves or to a cause that they care about. And when you think about it, this kind of strategic or tactical incivility is not really an abandonment of civility, or really even a fundamental undermining of civility. Instead, it's counting on the existence of a norm of civility, right? If there weren't some kind of norm of decent behavior, then I couldn't do something outrageous, right? We'd have to agree on what appropriate behavior is in order for me to strategically violate it and provoke outrage. And as I say, we see this a lot in politics. So it's not always the case that when you see someone in public life doing something that seems indecent or outrageous, it means that we're confronting some kind of crisis in civility. Having said that, the worry about the decline in norms of appropriate behavior in American public life goes beyond our politics, and it predates the presidential election in 2016. There were a lot of books and articles written about the crisis in civility before Donald Trump ran for president, even before he ran the first time.
I don't think it's fair to bring his name into the subject matter.
And I won't be talking about Donald Trump anymore in my comments, but if it comes up in the Q&A, we can discuss it. But think about our media coverage. You know, our media sensationalizes conflict and relentlessly stokes animosities, and this has been true for a long time. Think about the internet, life on digital platforms. If you've been on Twitter, you even have to tweet yourself. If you ever read Twitter exchanges, they can be pretty vicious. If you ever go to Syracuse.com and read the comment section, don't if you haven't. If you have, you know what I'm talking about. It's a cesspool. The workplace itself is a place where people encounter lots of rude, unpleasant, and civil behavior. So if you take this broader perspective, if you look beyond just our politics, you look beyond the presidential election, last one, or the coming one, it does look like we've got a crisis in civility. And people who've noticed this crisis have often called for a return to traditional courtesies. And the notion here is not that our disagreements would go away, but that we would interact in a more restrained and peaceful manner, that our public life would be more sociable, our politics would be more reasoned, life online and offline would be more pleasant. So what I'd like to talk about today is why this conventional call to restore traditional civility doesn't work very well. There are some problems with this conventional call. I want to explain what I see the problems being, and in the process indicate how I think, at least, civility works. So as Lewis mentioned, I wrote a book, came out a few years ago on civility called How Civility Works. So that's what I want to get towards, the idea how civility works. And the overarching message I hope to convey to you by the time we're done is that the way in which civility works is paradoxical. There are aspects of civility that are undesirable. There are ways in which civility is weak. But the very ways in which it's weak and undesirable are bound up with the ways in which it's powerful and appealing. So, what are some of the problems that the conventional argument for resurrecting traditional understandings of civility go wrong or run into problems? First problem to note. Today we talk about a crisis in civility when people point to political polarization, or they'll point to the internet, just as I've done in my introduction to the talk today. But we can also see every generation of Americans have complained about the deterioration of public conduct, and they had no trouble at all finding causes in their own time. So in the 20th century, beginning of the 20th century, people pointed to immigration as a source of incivility in the United States. They also pointed to jazz music, World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, rock and roll, the Vietnam War, large-scale entry of women into the workforce. Every generation complained that we were going to hell in a handbasket. In the 19th century, also continuous complaints about the deterioration of norms of appropriate behavior. 19th century Americans pointed to immigration. They pointed to urbanization, the rise of the cities is destroying good manners in the United States. They pointed to the Civil War. They blamed the vulgar rich. They blamed the insolent poor. At the time of our founding, the debate over the Constitution, the people who were engaged in that debate experienced their own time as a period of social deterioration and social crisis. The framers of the Constitution were very worried about the loss of an ethic of disinterestedness and the rise of a crass, materialistic politics in the states. So the first question we have to confront, and I think we have to answer, is if you're interested in civility, especially if you think that there's an older form of civility that we can bring forward. I think the first question you have to ask is, given the long history of rudeness in the United States, what makes us think we can get along now? Right? I mean, that is the reality, right? If you look at history, it's very fractious. Second question or problem that we have to confront if we're interested in civility. Even if civility is possible today, is it desirable? Proponents of civility see our contentious public culture as obviously dysfunctional. It's obviously messed up, it needs to be fixed. But perhaps it's not a failure. Perhaps our contentious public culture is not dysfunctional, it's actually an accomplishment. Consider the celebration of free speech. Think of us living in a free speech society. When we have free speech, what we want robust, uninhibited, wide open debate that allows for a competition of ideas, right? That's supposed to be the way in which we identify the truth. As we each make our arguments loudly and vociferously, it allows us to separate falsehood from truth. It even gives us a more vital grasp on truths we already know to be sound. So rather than seeking some more genteel way of managing our relationships to one another, why should we do that and deny ourselves the benefits of free expression? Why not just tell everybody to speak their minds and have a thick skin? What's so great about civility after all? So these are questions, and I've got answers to them, right? These are questions I think that we have to confront. And as I say, in answering these questions, what I hope to convey to you is that even though the weaknesses and problems related to civility are real, so too are civility's strengths. And they will find civility's strengths in its weaknesses. There's also a third problem with contemporary arguments for civility. It's a third question. And that's the bonus question. I'll tell you later, if you stick around. I know we've run out of coffee, but we've got a bonus question. So I'll let you know when we get to the third bonus round. Identify this third problem with conventional argument for civility. Okay, so first problem. Is civility possible? When we look at the history of conflict and rudeness in the United States, is it even possible today? You know, one thing when you go back and look at the literature on civility, and there's vast literature on civility, and you look at what people have written about good manners and appropriate behavior in public life, one thing you will notice right away is that no one agrees on the number of rules that there are for civility. George Washington, when he was a teenager, wrote down rules of civility. There were 110 of them that he wrote down. Okay. 110. P.M. Forney, who's a professor at Johns Hopkins University for many years, recently passed away. He had something called the Civility Initiative that he launched in Maryland. He also had the Civility Institute. He said there were actually 25 rules, not 110, 25 rules of civility. Emily Post, the author of Etiquette, and the Emily Post Institute, by the way, continues to produce etiquette as a volume. It's now in its 19th edition, came out last year, the 19th edition. There are literally hundreds of rules of appropriate behavior in etiquette. Lynn Trush, a British author and historian who wrote a book about manners in the United States and in England, said there's actually one rule of civility, only one. Her rule is other people exist, show some consideration. What we notice here is that there's this great variety of rules of civility, and it underscores a difference between civility and law. Law and civility kind of are similar in some ways because they have lots of rules, right? They're designed to govern individual behavior. But they do differ fundamentally because law has regulative institutions. We have institutions that tell us how to make new laws when circumstances change. We have institutions that tell us how to interpret laws, right? What do they mean? We have institutions that help us figure out what to do in the case of disagreement about how to apply a law, right? Those institutions are legislatures and courts, government, right? They're in place. We know what the law is. Civility is decentralized and entirely lacks this layer of regulative institutions. You learn civility, first of all, at home. It's the original home schooling. If we lived in a society that was static, that was fixed and homogeneous, then we wouldn't have a civility crisis because we'd all have the same rules that we learned at home. But we don't live in that society. We haven't lived in that society in centuries. We have an incredibly dynamic, diverse, heterogeneous society where we all learn different principles to some extent of appropriate behavior at home. And even when we learn the same principles, we learn different methods of application. I don't know if you've heard of Judith Martin. She writes under the pen name Miss Manners. Okay, so Miss Manners claims, we can certainly enforce civility. She says her own look of disapproval could sizzle bacon. She's got a strong look of disapproval. But the way civility functions in terms of enforcement is you really only get people, when you admonish them, to change their behavior if they already accept the legitimacy of the norm you're seeking to enforce. Right? You see somebody behaving rudely, and you reprimand them for their behavior. Unless they agree with you about the legitimacy of the norm you're seeking to see them follow, they'll just either react with anger or they'll shrug off your rebuke. So it leads to a curious thing about civility today. We think bad manners are everywhere. They're universal. Yet each of us does not believe that we individually possess bad manners. Right? They're ubiquitous, yet it's someone else. I was driving here, today, and there are all these jerks out on the road, but not me, right? And each one of us feels the same way. And this is shown over and over again on studies of civility. There's a national survey that goes out every year on civility in America, and they asked people in the survey, how often do you think other people are civil? And people respond on the whole, only about a quarter of the time do they think other people are civil. That means 3 out of 4 encounters you have with other people, you think that they are behaving in an indecent and civil fashion. Okay? 1/4 of the time they're civil. But they also ask people in the survey, how often are you civil? So, 94% of the time. So we have each one of us is following rules of appropriate behavior, but we're surrounded by all these jerks. We see the same thing with studies at the workplace. 98% of people in the workplace, a couple of business school professors have been looking at this for decades. 98% of people in the workplace have suffered boorish behavior. They have been treated in an uncivil fashion. Well, these researchers tracked down the people in the workplace who were supposedly offenders, the ones who were behaving uncivilly. Most of them had no idea that they had been treating other people rudely. And they had no idea about how to behave differently. So what's going on here? We have this experience today where we think common courtesy is no longer common. But that's not because of civility's absence. It's because of civility's excess. We feel like civility is under existential threat, but it's not because people out there don't think that there should be some baseline of respect that we owe one another, but it's because we're running around with many different notions of what that baseline of respect is. And if you look at our history of the United States, a lot of our greatest political struggles are really struggles over different conceptions of civility. So I'll just choose one example. We can talk about other ones during Q&A if you like. But one big example is the civil rights movement in the middle of the 20th century. You know, we think of the civil rights movement for its great legislative and judicial victories. Brown versus Board of Education, very important decision, right? Judicial decision that undermined the constitutional foundations of racial segregation. Voting Rights Act of 1965, Civil Rights Act of 1964, enormously important legislative accomplishments. But what was also going on in the civil rights movement was a battle over civility. Jim Crow segregation in the United States was not just a matter of laws and policies. Jim Crow segregation in the United States was also surrounded and sustained by a racial etiquette, by a set of manners, by an understanding of what counted as appropriate behavior. Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights activists understood themselves to be combating that conception of civility. In fact, King wrote about this in his letter from Birmingham jail. He detailed the kind of treatment that was considered to be appropriate, treatment between the races in parts of the country where Jim Crow segregation was in place. Where an African American adult male never referred to by his proper name, always called John. Or a married African American woman would never get the title of Mrs. She's always referred to by her first name. What civil rights activists were complaining about was this behavior that they found to be unacceptable because it was inegalitarian. But from the perspective of people who accepted the racial etiquette of Jim Crow segregation, they experienced civil rights activists as incredibly rude, as outside agitators that were behaving inappropriately. There are many other examples like this. It's not like people don't have a conception of appropriate behavior. It's that we have different conceptions of appropriate behavior. And we lack, as we don't in the case of law, we lack institutions that help us arrive at agreement on what our shared sense of civility ought to be. We don't work out our understanding of civility through appealing to courts or legislatures. We work it out through conflict itself. So that's my answer to the first question. Is civility possible? Yes, it's all too possible. It's coordination and agreement on what counts as civility that's difficult. Second question. What's so great about civility anyway? Why not have free speech? Why don't we just spend the next hour shouting at each other, right? Why don't we do that? Well, there have certainly been some great critics of civility. Many strong proponents of free speech have had some harsh words for civility. So John Stuart Mill, who wrote the essay on liberty, which is a great defense of free speech, did not like civility at all. He said, you know, we use rules of civility, we use rules of temperate speech to paint nonconformists as bad and immoral people. Civility is used to repress dissent, is what Mill said. And we see this repressive understanding of civility at work today when we see protesters. This still happens today, right now in the United States. You see it on college campuses, right? Black Lives Matter activists or anti-war activists protesting, and they'll be approached often by administration and say, you know, look, you'd be more successful if you just tried being polite. This kind of policing of the tone of protesters is experienced by dissenters as repressive, as relocating the problem from the injustice that the protesters are complaining about to their style of complaint. So there are, today, you can find easily people who criticize civility and want us to stop trying to achieve it and to just embrace robust, wide open free speech. And their argument is that civility at best is unnecessary for democracy, and at worst, it's a tool of the powerful. It's a way of silencing dissenters. So who needs civility, right? Well, I would argue that the people who criticize civility need civility. Why do they need civility? Well, what are the elements of persuasive speech? If I want to persuade you of something, it helps to be logical in my arguments. But I also should not forget to appeal to the emotions of the audience that I'm seeking to persuade. And importantly, I need to convey to you my integrity and my credibility. These are the elements of persuasion. It's not just the logic of your arguments, but it's your ability to appeal and to enlist the emotions of your audience, and your capacity for presenting yourself as a good and decent person, as a person of credibility and ethics. So, when we think about free speech and how it arrives at truth, it does so by rejecting lots of arguments, right? And it can really sting if your argument is rejected because people think that you lack credibility, that you lack integrity, that the reason you're not listening to me is because I'm morally deficient, right? I'm happier having you reject my arguments because you think they don't make sense than having you reject my arguments because you think there's something wrong with me, right? And I know what you're thinking. He's been talking, how long have I been talking? 25 minutes, and I haven't mentioned Erasmus. The wait is over. I'm now going to mention Erasmus. And his blockbuster book on manners that was written in the 1500s, on manners for children, huge bestseller, really, reprinted many, many times. And one of the things Erasmus said about civility and why it's important is because it's a simple, easily administrating way of broadcasting your decency to other people, right? Now, I know Lewis is a great guy because I've spent time with Lewis. I've hung out with him. We spent many hours together. Lewis comes up to the university, attends talks that I organize, right? But how is someone else to know Lewis is a great guy if they don't have the privilege that I have had of many hours in his company? Well, just by taking cues from his behavior, from his conduct. When someone behaves according to conventional standards of civility, they're not only granting you respect, they're signaling to you that they are reciprocally worthy of respect. Good manners communicate our goodness to people we're just meeting for the first time, people we may never meet again, right? You really get to know your friends, right, and your enemies. But the rest of us, we use civility to communicate to one another that we are good and decent people, even if we disagree. So the very people who often criticize civility as repressive, if you pay attention to what they're doing, they're not arguing for the end of civility. Often what they're arguing for is a revision of civility so it can be more inclusive. Remember those civil rights activists? Martin Luther King didn't want to get rid of etiquette. He wanted to revise it so it wasn't racist. Remember John Stuart Mill, who's a critic of civility? By the end of On Liberty, he's telling you, actually I'm in favor of civility if it's the right kind. Right? If civility doesn't marginalize dissenters, if it allows us to recognize that dissenters could be good and decent people, we just happen to disagree with their ideas, he's in favor of that kind of civility. So civility is something that we all want, we just disagree about what it should be and the kind of civility that we should get. And especially people often who are critics of civility, they're not seeking to dispense with civility altogether. They're seeking another kind of civility. How about that bonus question? Remember I promised a bonus question? Okay. The bonus question. Civility is valuable as a means of communication, as I've just described, when you communicate your goodness. But if you accept that, you have to confront a problem, which is that civility as a means of communication can be faulty. It can be faked. Erasmus, that guy who argued about civility in the 16th century, he had his critics. And what people said to Erasmus is like, hey, you say civility is a way of projecting your outward honesty and virtue. The problem is you need not have much virtue or any honesty in order to behave civilly. Civil behavior is a matter of outward display. It's a matter of showing respect to other people. You don't necessarily have to actually respect someone in order to show them respect. And advocates of civility have sometimes do this outright. Lord Chesterfield, who wrote a series of letters called The Art of Being a Gentleman, and this was in the 1700s, he addressed these letters to his illegitimate son, who he was trying to help out by just sending letters. This was the days before child support was mandated. Sending letters on good behavior. And these were subsequently published after Chesterfield's death, and they've never gone out of print since. In fact, just a couple years ago, they were issued as an ebook. And Lord Chesterfield said, quote, "The well-bred gentleman, like the chameleon, must be able to take every different hue," end quote. So manners are meant to convey something about your decency, but manners are really a mask. And even though they're meant to show you what the kind of person I really am, they can also disguise the kind of person that I really am. You know, the original definition of a con artist is a person of genteel appearance who swindles you. Right? A genteel swindler. What's the original crime of the con artist? The original crime, the first crime of the con artist, is that the con artist robs you of the belief that only good people have good manners. Right? Civility can be used as a mask. It can be hypocritically manipulated. We can use the conventions of civility to ingratiate ourselves to other people, to advance our self-interest, and to, the whole time, be an unrepentant rogue. This criticism of civility as a false front has some legitimacy to it. It's not incorrect, but it's not the whole picture. The very fact that civility can be hypocritically manipulated is something that can also be valuable. So I'll ask you to just perform a thought experiment. Imagine you live in a society where everybody in that society has high ideals. They have a conception of goodness that they want to achieve. But imagine at the same time, those very same people who have high ideas are principally driven by their low passions. They're vain, they're self-interested. They want to get whatever it is that they want. They have high principles, which they preach, but they're propelled by low passions, which make it incapable of them consistently realizing their moral ideals. In such a society, civility gives people the opportunity to appear to be good and decent without requiring much in the way of actual virtue. Civility enlists your desire, my desire, the desire we all have to look good, to look like we are good people. It harnesses that desire and gets us to behave better than we might otherwise behave. Now, if you've been closing your eyes during this thought experiment, open your eyes, look around you, that's that society describes society in which we live. The inauthenticity of civility is deplorable, but at the same time, it's necessary to secure social peace in a society filled with individuals that have moral aspirations, but flawed motivations. So let me conclude. Is civility in crisis? Is civility dead? Well, there are reasons to worry, right? We look around us and we see many people complaining about the absence of civility. We see other people complaining that civility is repressive, that it's a tool of the powerful, that it squelches free speech and it upholds status quo hierarchies. We see finally, bonus round, that civility is a false front. It is something that can be an artificial convention that they can use to hide unpleasant motivations. It's inauthentic. So you look at these criticisms of civility, you think, gee, if civility isn't dead, maybe we should kill it, right? There's bad things associated with civility. But these negative sides of civility, these weaknesses of civility, are also bound up with civility's strengths. Yes, we experience civility as being absent. That's not because people don't care about appropriate behavior. It's because we have so many different versions of what count as appropriate behavior out there. It's not civility's absence that we're experiencing, it's its excess. We see civility as an impediment to free speech, and we also see it as a means of underwriting free speech by providing a means of communication among people who otherwise disagree. We can think of it as a bulwark of the status quo, but we can also think of it as a means of leavening social relationships, right? Remember, Martin Luther King didn't want to end civility, he wanted a different kind. that would recognize the grant to African Americans the same basic respect that had been reserved just for white people. We condemn the inauthenticity of civility, yet we rely on the many opportunities for hypocritical manipulation that civility affords. These paradoxes explain how civility works. They tell us that even though the weaknesses of civility are real, these weaknesses are not a reason to give up. Instead, this is a call to join in. All those multiple conceptions of civility out there, all those historical political conflicts over competing conceptions of civility, what they teach us is that it's our responsibility to go out and fashion and frame the sort of civility we would like to see prevail. Remember, civility is a baseline of respect that you owe people in public life. That means anytime you're not alone, you have an opportunity to model the kind of civil behavior, the sort of respectful behavior you would like to see prevail. And just because you model it in your individual life, does that mean it's going to change society overnight? No. Does it mean that all of us will ever agree with your understanding of what is appropriate behavior? No. But it has always been the case. Ever since our society became diverse and heterogeneous, there's always been a struggle over what counts as appropriate behavior. The point is to not stop struggling. Civility does not exist outside of our politics as some kind of neutral force that can somehow render more peaceful and restrained our disagreements. Civility is determined through our politics, through our historical disputes. That's how we arrive at what should count as a rough consensus at any given time and how we ought to behave. We each have the opportunity and the responsibility to help develop a civility that is fit for a free and equal people. It's up to us to fashion the civility that we desire. Thank you for your kind attention. Happy to take questions. Louis, should I just call on people?
Yeah, call them, but first I can't say a word.
Okay.
How important it is for each of us to be civil to each other, let alone to our children, to our folks, to our neighbors. How important it is to be viewed as civil. Think about what I just said. Now ask your dumb question.
Yes.
So, that was a very interesting talk. My question has to do with...
Sorry, I'm sorry.
It has to do with factual reality, whatever that is. Do you think that the situation today, with respect to the number of people who have percentage of our population who have a consensus agreement as to what constitutes objective factual reality, is lower than in prior years, prior generations, prior times, when, because if you don't have a shared accurate perception of factual reality, then it's much harder to be civil, it's much harder to reach negotiated compromises on issues, and so it's that's the question, I guess.
Thanks for that question, and I think that it does certainly seem that way when we look around us. I did understand it. I will answer the question as I understood it, which doesn't mean I understood the question. So, but I think I hear what you're saying, I believe. Which is, you look around us today and you see that there are lots of people who don't agree just on basic empirical facts. And if we can't agree on basic empirical facts, what hope do we have of agreeing on values, right? Values of what constitutes respect. And is it the case now that we're living in a time when we have less agreement on empirical facts than we had in the past, right? Which would make this a period, it's kind of almost a unique inflection point maybe in our history, right? But this is bad. This is not just garden variety, people are disputing within some kind of shared framework. People have totally independent frames of reference with their own sets of facts. And there's no hope of having a community, a shared common sense. Is that?
Yeah, and those different perceptions of factual reality are kind of exacerbated by new media methods of dissemination of information that people listen to that, that support their preconceptions, biases, or whatever as to what is factual reality.
Right. And so I think it is certainly the case that these new methods of media accelerate, and I mean, the rate of dissemination is much more rapid than it ever was before. And it's much easier for anybody to publicize their own ideas to a larger audience without any possession of means, right? You don't have to own a press to print a newspaper to get your ideas out, right? You just have to have a free account on social media. But again, I think it is important to realize that historically we've had some very serious disagreements. And they've included disagreements about empirical facts. I mean, we did have a civil war. And so the Civil War, there's still disagreement about what that war was about today, right? So the Civil War was rooted in some fundamental differences of fact, and you could say bound up with value, because often they don't get separated, how you think about facts and values. Your values often determine which facts you consider to be salient, what facts you consider to be true, others you consider to be dangerous. But I do think we've had periods of intense conflict. Now, the Civil War is not a very cheerful example, right? Because it was, in fact, a war. It was not a culture war. It was a shooting war. And it still is the war with the largest number of casualties ever occurred. So I think we do see a depth to disagreement. I think it's important, though, at the same time to not confuse Twitter with America. There have been public opinion research done of political activists, and you find among political activists this two-world phenomenon. Different facts, different values, and hostility between the two. It really is a case where there seems to be, it's zero-sum. One side will win, and the other side winning, meaning that, one side winning means the other side must lose. They are fundamentally incompatible. But that's a view of activists. If you look at view of Americans as a whole, even on controversial issues, there has, until recently, been agreement. Right? Now this is, the question is whether this will persist. So take abortion, for example, very controversial issue. Most Americans, not all of them, and it's certainly not the activists in either party, adopt the old position that the Clinton administration, of all administrations, used to have, which is that abortion ought to be safe, legal, and rare. Right? Something that almost never happens, but if people have to appeal to and use the service, it should be safe and available. That's where public opinion on abortion for most Americans used to be. That doesn't mean anybody in this room actually has that view. I'm talking about on the great body of the American electorate as a whole. The question now is whether we're losing that kind of shared sensibility, because even in those shared sensibility about values in this case, right, and it still was compatible with a great deal of heterogeneity and disagreement. I think the worry now about how American politics is conducted is it's not just us and them at the level of activists and elites, but it's us and them at the level of you and me, right? And that's where we enter waters that I don't want to say are uncharted because we've been there, but they're waters that lead to, or path that leads to very bad outcomes, right? So to bring this back to civility, one of the things about civility, at least the way I've been talking about it here, is a means of communication. So me conforming to some understanding of appropriate behavior in order to convey to you my basic decency. I only do that if I care about what you think, right? You only do that if you care about what I think. If we stop caring about what one another thinks, if we dehumanize our opponents, if you see Democrats as evil, right, or vice versa, and there is some public opinion polling that suggests that's how people see members of the opposite party, then there's no reason to attempt to conform to some understanding of respectful behavior when relating to the other side. You can see this sometimes more easily in older societies. If we look back to, say, 17th century or 18th century England, an aristocrat could undress in front of his footman, and it wasn't some kind of gross violation of manners because his footman was not his social equal. His footman didn't exist socially for that aristocrat, right? So you could treat that person as a non-person. They were not somebody whose opinion you cared about. So civility, the very inauthenticity of it, the way it might fake it, manipulate it, like I might really be a jerk, but I'm behaving like I'm a nice person now, you might think like, wow, I don't like that. He's being inauthentic.
Oh, I told you that, kid. You don't come here unless you're civil.
Okay, so, but what it means, right, is that I care about what you think enough to behave civilly, and vice versa. If we didn't care about what one another think at all, if you dehumanized the person you're talking to, then that's when we have a true crisis in civility. At that point, civility is not a crisis. In fact, at that point, civility is dead, because we've stopped caring about what the other person thinks. And I think that's the worry about a fully polarized society, where you have complete disagreement on facts and values.
Well, isn't it nice that we do have these further ends, the west and the east and the north and the south, and it applies to civility to some extent, because some are more civil with each other or less civil with each other, and we're all not the same level of civility every moment of every day.
Well, I mean, and that's the great thing about, you know, when I said that, you know, civility, we have disagreement about it because we don't have any regulative institutions. The beauty of civility is that it's free, and we can each do it ourselves, right? I mean, it's like up to you how much of it to deploy. And you might think of how civility works in different relationships. I mean, your closest friendships or your spouse, are you civil with them? Yeah, but it doesn't fully exhaust the relationship. That would be a strange sort of arm's length, you know, relationship. Civility is really for society. It's public life. It's for our interactions with strangers. We're all dependent upon one another in a kind of minimal sense, right, to coordinate our action. But our interests are not all aligned. So what do we do? Well, you can imagine different solutions to this problem. One would be conversion to the same religion. That's an old solution. We all convert to the exact same religion, we have the same values, so we treat each other, not with civility, but maybe with a kind of love, because we all share the same faith. Well, what do you do to society where the same religion is not going to be, it's not realistic. People have different religions, or they have no religion at all. What do you do? Well, all we have are manners. That's all we have. And you may say, like, what are manners? They're just small modifications of speech and behavior. But it's out of that kind of gossamer that the reality of social occasions is constructed, right?
You want to others as you want them to do unto
Alice has got a word in.
Yes.
So you said first that somebody had 100 rules. I was thinking about Hillel. Do not unto others, do not act ways with others or say words to others that you would not like said that way, or how you respond to others or behave toward others. So why can't we just have one rule like that, and that's civility? Why does it have to be even 10 or 100?
Right. And Karen Armstrong, who wrote a history of monotheism, she's a former nun who now writes on theology. She has a project that was actually dedicated to surveying world religions and trying to identify if there was some article of faith that they had in common, and they identified one, and that's it. So whether you call it in the golden rule in Christianity, or if you select it, I mean, it's everywhere. You can find every religious tradition. The problem, I don't want to say problem with it, right? I'm going to say where it's incomplete, right, is that we have to recognize one another's common humanity for that do unto others rule to lead to reciprocal.
Do not unto others.
Do not unto others, right. But if you don't, if Lewis doesn't recognize my humanity, so since I know Lewis, it's just a hypothetical, posing this here, right? Then if he has, that's not a restraint on his behavior towards me, right? He only has to, if he has only he only sees in his circle a set of people, and those are the people, do not unto others, you happen to do not unto you. What's his restraint on treating people, someone he doesn't recognize as fully human, right? And so this is why I said that civility does require us to care about what other people think. If you cease to care at all about what another person thinks, and in fact, more than that, you dehumanize them, you deprive them of essential qualities of their humanity. And it happens all the time, right? This is not a historical phenomenon, this is also a contemporary phenomenon. Then that rule doesn't work. I think one of the things about civility, unlike religious precepts, is it doesn't suppose that you have much in the way of virtue. All it supposes is that you want to look good. That's all that it supposes, right? Now, again, that doesn't even work, because do you want to look good in front of every conceivable audience? The old idea of civility is, yes, it's rooted in an old understanding of human nature that even though we have reason and ethics, that's not the most powerful motivations for us. It's our passions and desires that will drive us. And our passions and desires are incredibly destructive. So what do we do if we're all driven by passions and desires and our reason and our ethics are weak? They're like Jiminy Cricket. They're always the little insect in our ear telling us what we're doing wrong, but we can easily ignore it and do what we want. Well, the old solution to this problem, the non-religious solution, was to identify one of those passions and make it the master of the other passions. So the original argument for capitalism was to elevate greed, right? Greed is a passion, but it's a passion that you can calculate on. It's a more stable passion than, say, the desire for glory. So you make greed the master passion, and it makes us a less martial society. We're no longer a warrior society. We're a society of merchants, right? Which maybe makes us cruel and exploitative in some ways, but at least we're not getting more of what we want by killing people, right? We're just exploiting them. So civility is the same way, right? At least the old arguments for civility. You take one passion, the desire to look better than you are, which is not very admirable, right? But you take that passion and you make it the master of other passions, right? So I behave in a way that conforms to conventions, to some understanding of respect. Not because I'm actually a virtuous individual, but just because I want to look good, right? So it's not to say that we can't have agreement on rules. It is to say that we have to identify what is the motive to want to use those rules. And I think one of the fundamental motives, really, in civility, and the great worry that we may no longer have, is that we have to care at least how we look in the eyes of others. If we stop caring about that, that is the beginning of separation, division, and ultimately violence, as we've seen before in the history of this country and we see around us in the world today. Yeah.
Well, politically, first of all, thank you for this wonderful, unique lecture.
Oh.
But politically today, we're using lack of civility as attention-getting behavior.
That's right.
And it works.
Yeah.
Too.
It does. Yeah.
I have never, our
Careful.
current,
Be careful what you're gonna say. I know what you're gonna say, go ahead.
Well, I don't know what you're going to say, so
But
let
I
it
got
out.
an idea.
a high official in this country.
GOP.
Who
I'm not talking about the mayor of Fayetteville.
other people by names,
Yes.
makes up weird names. And somehow, I'm turning on that television to listen, what's he gonna say next? And I think that it's really interesting and.
Sure, and it's actually it's great TV, right?
It is.
And I think something that's interesting about Trump rallies, as compared to other presidential rallies, is that Trump has really kind of broken new ground in the rallies in a couple of ways. One is that presidents have often had rallies, even when they're in office, right? They start having them early. Usually, there's some kind of initiative or plan they're seeking to call attention to, and that's what they're rallying around. Trump does the same thing, at least initially sometimes. He said this rally is going to be about, my new trade policy. Right? NAFTA's terrible, we're going to have new negotiations. We're going to have a rally about how terrible NAFTA is and having new negotiations. But the rallies never stay on point, right? They always, it's almost kind of, there's a script to them, and they're very stable. They run through the derogatory nicknames that the president has developed, not only for Democrats, but for celebrities, other Republicans, right, for a whole kind of list of people. A lot of the attention is directed back to Trump himself and his achievements. And so even though they're ostensibly about a particular issue, the rallies look very different, right? And part of I think what they're tapping into is that norm violation can be fun. Right? It can be fun to see someone flouting the proprieties. It's not just the case that strategic incivility generates publicity that you could use for another purpose. It's entertaining.
Yeah.
There's a very strong, powerful entertainment factor. A colleague of mine who teaches, well, you've met before, Matt Dickinson, teaches at Middlebury College. In the 2016 presidential election cycle, he went to campaign rallies for all 17 of the Republican nominees during the primary season. In fact, he went to a Gilmore rally where Gilmore wasn't even there. That's how entertaining it was. And as the election went on, he continued to attend Trump rallies, and he said that one of the things about them is they were just fun. They were really joyous occasions. It was not just good TV, right? They're fun to attend. And there is this element of, kind of when you poke somebody in the eye, it can be kind of fun. I mean, you see high school pranks, these sorts of things. So I think there's an element of fun to it, right? And then the question is, well, is it just entertainment? Is there something more going on? It's related to the question, is it just strategic or tactical norm violation? Is there some more fundamental assault on civility afoot? And I think there is, but I think it's not an effort to dispense with civility and transform our public life into just universal insults. I think it's an effort, and I don't think that the president, I'm not saying like the president has a conscious plan or detailed 5-point platform on this, but to inaugurate a new set of manners in American life. And we see this in the criticisms of political correctness. Right? So I do think there is a deeper transformation afoot. Yeah.
So with what you're saying, do you think, at his rallies, do you think the people are there as supporters or there for the show?
I think both. I think both. You do see some people going, it's funny, by funny I mean interesting. If you remember that event, it took place a little while ago. It was not at a rally, but it was in DC. And there were these high school kids, and they were wearing Make America Great hats, and there was this kind of confrontation with a Native American drummer, and it turned out that there was a lot going on in that situation, right? But what the high school kids were all wearing, I don't know last time any of you were in DC, but that's like now kind of the fun of going to DC. You just see big groups of people. They're not Trump supporters, they're just necessarily. It's just like the fun thing to do. Just like, I got on my MAGA hat, right? And I think it's fun to go to the rally, get the locker up t-shirt, right? You see the media, they're kept in a cage. They're pinned, the media are pinned. And it's kind of fun, and I think that there's a core of supporters who are really there because they agree with the president, they're supporting the president's policies. And I think there are other people there who are the spectacle. And then there are people in between.
But I've read where some of those people were paid to wear these hats and their shirts or whatever.
Sure, I mean, there was, at least in the initial rallies, I don't think there was so much payment going on now because it's such a phenomenon. I mean, Trump has, 32 million followers on Twitter? Which is less than half of the followers that Kim Kardashian has. So just to keep things in perspective. But yeah, so I think that, again, there's an element of fun to it. And I think that it's the kind of, even though it's serious, it can be fun, right? I mean, and this is how a lot of our comedy works. It's sort of like, tweaking norms being set. And again, the question is not that tweaking could just be it's tweaking. That's all it is. And it's satire and it's fun. Just in the same way somebody does something outrageous once, right? And then reverse normal pattern behavior. After Marco Rubio made fun of Trump's hands, he reverted to totally conventional, Marco Rubio did, campaign behavior. Trump, on the other hand, right, and so that's why I think there is something more fundamental, at least in the minds of some of Trump's supporters. It's a real desire to change the way in which what the baseline of respect is in the United States for certain groups.
But don't you worry about that baseline changing?
Oh, no. I do. I mean, I think the thing, again, what we see historically is just because you have a change at one period in time does not lock it in, right? So in the early 19th century, for example, a woman could not appear in public without a male companion, without it being scandalous. Much less a woman standing up and advocating some political position, like, say, anti-slavery or female suffrage. So for women to participate in our public life, we had to have a fundamental change in what counted as respectful, decent behavior with regard to women. A fundamental change. Now, we don't have a proportional number of women proportional to their percentage of the population in politics, right? It's not like 51% of the Senate is female, but we do have a lot of women who participate in politics at every level in the United States. That does not mean that we are a gender egalitarian society. That does not mean that there are not groups right now that are advocating for a return to a different set of spheres, right? There's a whole men's rights movement out there, right, that's sticking to it. So just because you have
for that.
just because you have a calibration of respect at one period doesn't mean it's not subject to change on the next roll of the dice. So if you think about, we're a country of immigrants, Right? That's a sort of standard, used to be just sort of a standard thing to say. The government used to say that in its own material. It used to be on the website, as a matter of fact, for the Citizenship and Immigration Service in the United States. The Trump administration scrubbed that from the website. It no longer says we're a nation of immigrants. Why is that? Because I think there is a view that not all immigrants actually deserve the same level of respect. There are some immigrants that do. They are worthy of our respect, and there are others that are not. This is the view. That's a recalibration, the so-called, I won't use the vulgarity here, the idea that there are countries that are in some kind of hole, it smells, and there are others that are not, right? Norwegian immigrants, good. Mexican immigrants, criminals. So that idea, that's an effort to reset a baseline of respect, right?
I'm not so sure that's so new. I mean, we did have the Japanese Exclusion Act.
Sure.
And we had very definite laws on what could be, who could be an immigrant and who could not.
No, that's absolutely right. There's a long history, but Ben Franklin complained about German immigrants, right? And so after, in the 1960s, when we ended these exclusion, this was really, this idea that we are a nation of immigrants was itself a change in public respect that was conveyed, that was sort of bestowed on immigrants. It's a recent settlement, as you said, right? So it's within living memory that this has changed. What I'm saying is that that doesn't mean, just because it's changed one way, doesn't mean it can't change back, right? It's not like this is a one-way ratchet where we just go in one direction, we can never revert to another way of looking at it. Again, civility and what counts as civility is determined through our politics. So depending on the political disputes we have and the settlements at which we arrive, we could end up with, in 25 years, a very different set of norms that are advocated by a majority of people in their ordinary lives that would make the way we behave towards each other now seem strange and antique.
This is overly simplistic, but what happens when you lose the divergence between civility and law, where a lack of civility seems to undermine the regulatory institutions?
Right. And so there have been cases in the past where people appeal to law to fix problems in civility. And these even happen locally in the present. There was a story in the New York Times last year about people failing to curb their dogs at some condo complex in New York City, right? And so they passed a rule in the condo association to do, believe it or not, DNA typing of all the feces of the animals. And so we knew whose pet was what, so you could find something, sample it, keep Bybee's dog, clean up after it, and you get fined, okay? And we used, we used to have laws that determined what counted as a decent movie that could be shown, right? In the Hayes Act, not allowed certain laws to be shown. So when people have a sense of crisis, that there's standards of civility are no longer being upheld, we have a history and a contemporary practice sometimes of appealing to law to fix the problem of civility. That's not good. And the reason why, at least one reason why it's not good, is it elevates the stakes for our individual conflicts, right? So if I treat Lewis rudely, he's very capable, I think as you all know, of responding quickly to what he would perceive to be as a slight, right? It's just between him and me, right? And either I change my behavior or apologize or whatever. Right now, if I've broken the law, we elevate the stakes of that encounter. And that elevation of stakes makes it much harder.
It elevates the stakes of the level of friendship and the respect that I have for you, and maybe that I hope you have for me even. But you being civil is part of the deal, baby.
Yeah, well.
I'm sorry. If you weren't civil, somewhat, from my perspective, hit the road.
Well, so, but I know, and I think that's right? But what we want to have for civility is we want it to encompass everybody in so-called polite society. I think what we see when we look historically and what we're experiencing to some extent today is an effort to gerrymander the boundaries of polite society, so that we draw the circle of polite society so some of us are in and other people are out. And again, when that is happening, sometimes there's an appeal to law to reset. Miss Manners, and I think she's probably right about this, things about manners and law are best understood as kind of a symbiotic relationship, right? Where law takes care of the big disputes. If someone's murdered, we want to have law there to really kind of insert the order. But the small stuff, you want to allow manners to handle. Because if you take out the big guns for a small dispute, then it makes it very difficult for us to interact on a daily basis. Law is too cumbersome. It has, the penalties are too stiff, the punishment's too severe for it to be a basis on which just we negotiate our everyday interactions. But we have to be prepared, and we can see that in a context where people feel that a certain norm of civility is no longer being obeyed, they will enlist law as a solution. And it's not a solution, because the underlying problem is that we've lost consensus on how we ought to treat one another. Yeah.
Well, what happens when the incivility starts to threaten someone like the press?
Well,
Like the president
right.
has brought in his charges of enemy of the people.
Right.
That the press is the enemy of the people. That threatens their physical safety.
That's right. That's right. And you do see, again, to take this back, to use the, to analogize to the civil rights movement in the middle of the 20th century, right? Violating the racial etiquette of Jim Crow segregation could lead to your death, the violent death, right? And so when I say raise the stakes, I don't mean to say that the only thing that can happen to you when you behave uncivilly is someone could wag a disapproving finger. People can react extremely strongly and violently to violations of norms of behavior, right? And I think what's interesting about the president is that he criticizes the press and calls them enemy of people, but he also praises the press, right? He seeks to pick the wheat from the chaff. There's good press, there's bad press. And what he wants to do is hold up for respect and valorization certain news outlets, certain forms of the press, and castigate others. And, you know, it's not like he's written off, say, the failing New York Times, as the president refers to the New York Times. It's always the failing New York Times. He hasn't written them off entirely. He has said before that, you know, he's still waiting for the kind of like big coverage he thinks he should get as the hometown favorite, right? So New York kid who's now president, he should have the New York Times, you know, going to bat for him. And so I think if the New York Times were to change and become more, less adversarial in its coverage, and we have an adversarial press in many respects. I mean, the original idea is an adversarial press is how we keep government restrained and honest, right? But if they became less adversarial, I think it would no longer be the failing New York Times. So the president's not against all press. Again, it's against some press. Some press is very good, some press is very bad. Now the question is the degree to which that will change the way we all look at the press. And I don't see that happening. What I see happening is the polarization, where we began. Right? People end up kind of migrating. And it's almost now become part of your identity. Which teams do you root for, right? Is that the Yankees or the Mets? Is it Fox News or is it the New York Times? Right? It's kind of like it becomes part of our identity. But even that's not new. Coming back to the kind of like how everything old is new again. In the 19th century, all press was partisan. All news was fake in the 19th century. But parties ran newspapers. There was no independent press. In fact, you can find criticisms of the ideal of objectivity in the 19th century. They say, why would you be objective? I know what the answer is. I mean, I can't be objective between truth and falsehood. I'm going to advocate the truth, which is the understanding of the press worked in the 19th century. So we've been through periods that have been worse in the sense that there's no one even out there trying to gather and verify facts. There was the interviewing, which we think is a basic mechanism of news gathering, did not become common in the United States in the late 19th century. Interviewing. There was no interviewing. Why do you need to interview? I know what the facts are. I know, if I know the truth, why do I have to go ask you about it? I'm just going to publicize it and try to mobilize you around what I know the truth to be.
So you were talking about these rallies being a show, but in my mind they're not just a show. And in fact, Trump is practically in bed with the Hungarian prime minister. There's only one party there. The newspaper, forget that. And Trump has actually said he likes, I'm paraphrasing him, he likes to hang out with authoritarian leaders.
Right, and so...
And this is very scary to me.
And so, yeah, so this is why when Louis asked me to talk about what was going to happen in politics, I said, let's talk about civility instead. Because I was hoping to, I mean, I don't know, the longer, even medium-term trajectory where we're headed. It certainly is the case that there are a number of people who have written in unbelief that we're on the road to kind of a sort of authoritarianism. What I would say about, just on the press question though, right? Back to the New York Times. The New York Times has never seen the kind of growth that it's had in digital paper subscriptions since 2016. The New York Times has never made more money than it's making right now. So we're simultaneously seeing it. So the full picture, and not to disagree with your characterization, but simply say that I think the full picture is that we have multiple things going on in society at once. We have a president who has a very strong point of view and is seeking to make coalition with some countries that we wouldn't have thought would be natural coalition partners for us.
I
On
don't
the other
disagree
hand-
with the New York Times making money out of it. I mean, I'm glad that they're printing all this information.
That's right.
But,
But go on.
but
But what I'm saying is that if we think about, if we're worried about going to a society where the government controls the press, right, then we're not there. In fact, we seem to, I mean, depending what part of the press you look at, we've never had more robust watchdog press working on behalf of the American public than we do today. So I'm not saying, all I'm saying is that it's not to deny that people can't look at the current administration and say that it's headed in a way that we might consider to be anti-democratic or undemocratic. It is to deny that that is the only thing going on, or that we are Turkey right now, or the level of corruption that Mexico experiences, or, you know, I mean, so it's not a defense of the status quo, simply to say that I think we're at a time of intense, incredible disagreement, right? So, yeah.
Going into the next round of debates next year, do we fight fire with fire, or do we let him fire off and you sit there and be civil about it? What's the best way to fight this thing?
But remember, you know, civility is kind of a two-sided coin. We often focus on one side and say that the civil person is the reasonable, nice person, right? But remember, civility is, and norms of appropriate behavior are enforced, other side of the coin, through reprimand, rebuke, and in extreme cases, even violence, right? So civility doesn't mean weakness, right? Civility can actually be bound up with tremendous amount of very strong enforcement of the norm itself, right? And I think that what you're seeing a little bit going on right now between now there are 21 Democratic candidates, like that, might be 22.
I think there's 22 now, the other guy just jumped in.
Yeah, the other guy, another governor, just jumped in. The front runner, Vice President Biden, is of the mind, I think, that Trump is an individual aberration, right? That there's this, that it's a matter of, it's not a matter of some kind of deeper dispute about who we are, how we ought to behave. We just have one opportunist, this is what Biden's view, who needs to be ejected from office, right? And that once that's done, then we'll be fine. So I think Biden's approach is going to be, if you think about the relationship between, say, Trump and the Republican Party, I think Biden's approach is sort of like, hate the sin, love the sinner, right? You treat Trump as an aberration, but you don't say that means all his supporters, something wrong with them. That was a mistake that Hillary Clinton was thought to have made. Sort of like deploring or painting as deplorable Trump supporters, right? And I think Biden's going in a different route. He is the front runner right now, is saying that no, it's really there's this flawed, deeply flawed individual who, in this position of power,
But now
dangerous.
you've got 2 Republicans running against Trump now, too.
Yes, well, you got William Weld, right?
The guy out of Connecticut was on TV last night, he just jumped in.
And I wonder how they'll do. Weld is a never-Trumper, right? And the Republican Party has changed. I mean, the Republican Party, the number of Republican Party identifiers, people who say they're Republicans, has shrunk. And you have a number of people who used to identify the Republican Party, and it's just on polls. I don't even talk about how you're registered. So it's very low stakes. Someone's just calling you up, right? Asking if you're a Republican. That number has shrunk. I mean, I think the Republican Party, as it remains, is a pro-Trump party. I think it's really...
As it remains.
As it remains. And so it's not the same party that it was. Again, it's an example of how things can change, right? You think that you have an idea of what a political party stands for, or what a norm of behavior is. But we realize that's a short-sighted view. It's just it can change. Who would have thought, 3 years ago, that the Republican Party would be adopting some of the positions that it's adopting and seeking and implementing now? It's quite surprising. That doesn't mean that people stop calling themselves Republicans. is that they become a different kind of Republican.
So, one of the things that's happened in recent years is that the number of Republicans and Democrats at the national level, in Congress at least, who got to know one another socially, civilly, has shrunk.
Yeah.
And because generally speaking, they go home to mend the fences and to receive constituent input or whatever on their time off. And so the natural human interaction between two groups that disagree with one another on issues, but which can kind of be greased by actual face-to-face social interaction, that's sort of gone away.
That's right.
So and then simultaneously you get this shrinkage of the moderates on both sides. They get primary, they get, when the dust clears, you have two sides who find it almost impossible to compromise about anything. So how do we make any progress going forward on any of the major issues?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because you're absolutely right. The goal, I mean, sort of one of the first rules that the House of Representatives passed when they formed in 1791 were these rules of decorum. And Congress as a whole used to be a great site of civil disagreement. People had different policy views, but they disagreed very civilly. But at that time, what underwrote it, and you're absolutely right, is a lot of these members of Congress lived together in boarding houses when they were not going home. And now you're in D.C. maybe 2-3 days a week max, and you're going away. Paul Ryan slept in his office that became like, it didn't even have a residence, right? Because it was considered to be, that would show you being captured by the swamp if you were paying rent or owned an apartment. So you're absolutely right. There's this total social, there used to be this social, dense social interaction. Now there's total social segregation between the two parties.
You got a guy that keeps poking the bee's nest all the time.
And there are people who are always stirring the pot, right? And so Congress itself, there have been periodic efforts, and there's one that's in place right now, seeking to restore civility through retreats. They'll take members of Congress on retreats, and they'll say, invite your families, and there'll be barbecue. And maybe we'll even have a magician. I don't know, make it fun, right? And these have failed. These have all failed because I think members of the party really don't, going back to one of our original themes, don't care what the other side thinks. If you are a Democrat, right, elected, say, from New York City, right, let's say your initials are AOC, right? Why do you care what Republicans think? You have no reason to. They're not a significant part of your district. They're not, they're no part of your political present or future, right? They're useful for you to demonize and raise funds on, and vice versa. It's not like she's an outlier, right? This is part of the system, and this is how they all behave. I don't know what the answer to that is, absent some kind of structural reorganization, because it's been a structural change. That's why I was saying earlier, the way our political elites behave and think is different from the way we all behave, because we do interact with one another, although that is changing. Increasingly, Democrats and Republicans don't even live near each other. They have different pastimes, they're attracted to different professions. That's very troubling. Yeah, you can find this great sort is taking place in the United States. And it's by no means complete, right? But it is happening. It is happening. And that trend, even just like preferences, like where people prefer to live. Democrats tend to like to live in places that are more densely populated. Republicans prefer to live in places that are single-family homes. These are sort of becoming tendencies, right? You might say like, well, gee, I like having a yard, and gee, I like living in a place where I can get good takeout, right? Those are two different places, but increasingly the places where people feel more comfortable where they land are sorted in that way. So the problem we've already seen occur in federal government and Congress is now coming to the rest of us in society, which makes even more urgent the work of modeling the sort of civility you'd like to see in everyday life, right? It also means reaching out to other people. Don't just sort of huddle with your own. We have to care about what other people think. We have to see the humanity in other people, or we're doomed. Which, that sounds like kind of a
Divided we fall.
And divided we fall. United we stand. There, I'll say that's a positive.
Before we go down, next week, Jason Small is coming here with Nikki Tamero, who is the have sports for one of the local channels. So it's gonna be, the format will be a little different. It'll be an interviewing about the Syracuse Mets as they starting to fold up, not from words, move up the ladder and how they're enjoying themselves in the community from the old relationship, which changed now with the Mets. And how this thing is going to, this deal that the Mets have made with the local guys. You understand the number, Keith?
That sounds big.
For a baseball team, right? In Syracuse, New York. But anyway, that's, you come, you're gonna learn some more about sports. You're gonna learn about how the major leagues impact the minor leagues. And it's amazing, it's a business. Now, anybody else want to say something about civility? Because we're all gonna be civil with each other. Thank you, Dean.